On your screen is a picture from 1937. It's a man named Ed Kiefer and a couple of college sweethearts. Let me tell you about Ed Kiefer real quick. Ed, in this picture, is a senior at the University of Toledo in Ohio. He's a member of the Honor Society, president of the Calculus Club, vice president of the Engineering Club, real ladies' man. And he creates this instrument that you see kind of in the middle of the picture here, which he calls the Cupidoscope. Here's the point of the Cupidoscope. He had a lot of college sweethearts, and he was trying to figure out, is there a way to quantify love? Is there a way to figure out, how do you measure love? That's the question that he's dealing with. And so he brought couples together and promised them that he could figure out, with just hold on to these instruments, hold on to that, and I'll figure out if you are really in love, if this thing is really going to last. And so a man would grip one side, a woman would grip the other side, and they would move toward one another until they felt a literal spark, like an electrical spark, not a love spark, just until you felt a spark. And he had some way that he was going to judge whether or not this couple was really in love, really based on her tolerance for this mild current. And so he had a register there that would register how strong this attraction spark was. And on this meter, it ranged from absolutely no hope to you better call a preacher today. The Cupidoscope in the quest to quantify love. I think that's interesting. Budding lovers want to see where they are in a relationship. And all they had to do was simply hook up to this invention of Ed Kiefer and figure out if their love was going to last or if it was just going to be fleeting. How do you measure love? It's a question that goes back at least to 1937, but it's actually a question that goes back long before that. How do you measure love? There's got to be a way, there's got to be a standard. We talk about falling in love and falling out of love and being so full of love. There's got to be a way to measure love. We think about commitments in love. We think about marriage and homes that are built on love. How do you measure love? It's an important question, especially for people who want to follow Jesus. In fact, it may be one of the more important questions than we could ever talk about. How do you measure love? Well, Jesus talked about, and the early Christians wrote a lot about, the importance of love in our lives. They were questioned about what matters most, and they talked about love. They listed out, commandments, and love a lot of times comes at the forefront of those lists of commandments. Whenever they were asked about the most important things in the world, oftentimes they landed on love. For instance, if you got your Bibles in Luke chapter 10, you're going to find a situation there where Jesus is confronted by an expert in the law. What that means is he's an expert in the Bible, in what God's word says. And he comes to Jesus in Luke chapter 10, and he says, tell me, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Now, the way this question is phrased in other places is sometimes like, what is the most important commandment? And so Jesus turns this man's question around on him, and he says, what is your reading of it? How do you read the law? And the man, the lawyer, expert in the law, gives a great answer to that question. He says, well, to love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. By the way, that's one quote from Deuteronomy, love your God, and one quote from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus didn't ask him two questions. He said, what's your reading of it? What's the most important thing? And the man has already linked together, love God, and you show that love for God by how you love your neighbor. Now that man is going to go into trying to trap Jesus and say, well, just who is my neighbor, which gives Jesus the opportunity to tell the story of the Good Samaritan and show him exactly who his neighbor is and what love demands for somebody like that. That's in Luke chapter 10. And so already Jesus is pointing to the fact that when somebody asks, what do I need to do? The answer to that is love. When somebody's asking him in later places, what do I need to do, or what's the most important commandment? Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. But how do you measure love? It's a good question. It's an important question. Because in John chapter 13, Jesus is meeting with his disciples. Danny talked about that just a few minutes ago. He's meeting with his disciples in an upper room. As they come in, Their feet are dirty, and nobody's, thought to have somebody there to wash their feet. None of the other disciples are going to do that because they're so interested in who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God. And so they're not going to get down and wash somebody. But Jesus does. He takes the towel, puts it around his waist, gets a basin of water, and goes around and he washes the feet of the disciples. He tells them in John 13, I've given you an example so that you can go and do as I have done. He says in John 13:34, a new commandment I give you. Now, the command to love one another is old. It's a couple thousand years old at this point in the life of Jesus. But he says, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another, and here's the new part, as I have loved you. Love one another, old, as I have loved you. They just learned that, and it's a self-sacrificing kind of love. It's important because in verse 35, Jesus says, the world will know that you are mine, you are my disciples, by the love that you have for one another. The world will know that you're a Christian, Jesus says, by the love that you have for one another. It's important. Jesus says this is how people will know that you are a follower of Jesus, by the love you've got for one another. But how do you measure love? It's a good question. It's an important question. In Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, Paul is writing this great letter, lays out all kinds of theology in the first 10 or so, 11 chapters. And then at chapter 12, he starts making it very practical. And so he talks to them about being transformed by the renewing of their mind, not conformed to the world. And then through chapter 12, he shows them exactly what that looks like. And he lists out almost point by point, here's what a Christian life looks like, transformed by the renewing of the mind, not conformed to the image of the world. In chapter 13, he gets a bit better at some point, but in verses 8 through 10, he narrows it down again. And he says, this whole law, the don't commit adultery, the don't covet, the honor your father and mother, all these laws that were very familiar to them, he says in Romans 13, they can all be summed up in this one command, verse 8, and I believe he repeats it in verse 10, to love your neighbor. And so for Paul, in Romans 13, it's very important. He says the same thing in Galatians chapter 5, verses 3 through 5, where he tells them, he again says, the whole law is summed up in this, love your neighbor as yourself. I'd like for us to read together 1 John chapter 4, if you got a Bible. 1 John chapter 4, verse 7. John is writing a little bit later, has probably had a little time to let this marinate before he writes this, but here's what he says. He says, beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world, that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we've loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be a propitiation for our sins. Verse 11, beloved, if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. Nobody has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. It's pretty important. I didn't count how many times John uses the word love in those 5 verses or so, but it's got to be 15 or 20 times. Love is important. But how do you measure love? How do I know if I'm doing that? How do I know if I'm following the instruction of Jesus in loving one another as he's loved us? How do I know if I'm loving my neighbor as myself? How do I quantify love? How do I know if I'm following Paul's writing in Romans 13 and Galatians 5? How do I know if I'm following John's instruction in 1 John chapter 4 and seeking out love for one another? How do I know? Well, for that, I'd like for you to turn to 1 Corinthians 13, and this will be where the rest of our lesson comes from. There are a lot of important things in Christian life, and I don't want you to hear me today and say, it doesn't matter what I do if I love. It doesn't matter what I think or what I believe. I'm not saying that at all. Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 13, that now abide faith, which is important, and hope, which is important. Nobody's going to discount those. Faith, hope, and love remain. And Paul's the one who says the greatest of these is love. And so there's a lot of talk about love in Scripture. There's a lot of talk about love in the life of Jesus. If Jesus said that we'll be known as his people by the love that we have for one another, it's a pretty important topic. If Jesus understood love as the answer to what's the most important thing you're going to do, then it's pretty important for us. But again, that leaves us with the same question and problem that Ed Kiefer was trying to solve in 1937 with his Cupidoscope. How do you measure love? If it's so important, and it is, well, how can I know that I'm doing it? If it's the whole law summed up in a word, then how do I know that I'm keeping it? If it's the way that we know God, according to John in 1 John chapter 4, then how do I know that I'm doing it so that I know God? How do I know if I'm loving? How do you measure love? Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul gives us a 15-point test to figure out if we are loving. They're going to be on the screen for very brief amounts of time. If you're a note taker, note take quickly for a few minutes. Or, you know what? They're all listed in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7. It's 15 points that Paul gives us to describe love. My guess is that as we go through this 15-point list, there will be a few, maybe a handful, maybe 15 or so, that seem to stick out as a struggle for us. Make note of those. Jot those down. Keep those in your mind, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes. So number one on Paul's list of 15 is that love waits patiently. How you doing? Already failing the test, maybe? Love doesn't rush in before the time is right. It respects God's timing, doesn't have a short fuse. That's what love is. Love waits patiently. Doesn't blunder in, doesn't blurt things out. How would you describe your patience level? How would your spouse describe your patience level? I'm going to look this way because mine sits right here. Need a little work? That's number one. Love shows kindness is number two. Kindness is interesting. It's a pure, unselfish concern for the well-being of another. We might be pretty good at loving, unless it involves somebody else. I'm pretty good at loving myself, but love is kind to others. How do you show kindness to others? With the people that you interact with every day of your life, people you live with, work with, go to school with. What would they say about your level of kindness? That's number two on Paul's list. How you doing? Love doesn't burn with envy. That's number three. It doesn't look at what everybody else has and wish that I had it, so much so that I really don't like that person who's got what I wish I had. Love doesn't want what they have for themselves. Love has learned to be content with what we have. The people that know you best, how would they describe your level of contentment with what you have? That's number three. Number four is love doesn't brag. It's not boastful. It doesn't always have to give its own spin on its life. It doesn't have to make itself look a little bit better than it really is deep down. Do you find yourself inserting yourself into a lot of conversations where you really don't have to insert yourself? That's an unloving behavior according to Paul. Number six, love is not inflated with its own importance. The word that Paul uses there is filled with air, puffed up. That's how he describes it sometimes. It's filled with air, but really no substance underneath. It adds attention to the self over and over again. It cultivates attention-seeking behavior because it wants people to look at me and see how important I am. When you think about the words that you use about yourself, are you inflating your own importance? Number seven, love is not preoccupied with the interests of the self. It doesn't seek to use words or actions to manipulate others into doing what I want them to do. Love does not behave with rudeness. Love doesn't disrespect other people. In fact, it's an attitude of respect for other people. And that means that love, if I love others, it means I will restrain my own self-will so that I don't offend other people. Love doesn't have to be the center of attention. Love doesn't become exasperated to the point where I resent you for what I believe about you. It doesn't allow itself to become provoked. Love doesn't overreact. That requires patience, and that's not easy if I struggle with selfishness at times. Love does not nurse hurts into grudges. It doesn't let something fester. How long do you tend to hold on to thoughts, bad thoughts that you have about other people, when you feel like you've been slighted? You feel like you got to keep score so that you can get even. It's a pretty unloving behavior in Paul's writing. Do you feel like you always owe somebody something for what they've done to you? You're keeping a reckoning of evil. Do you keep a scorecard? You want to get even. That's not love. So the next one is one that my guess is that if you've got a problem with anything I say in this lesson, it'll be with what this next line in Paul's list is. Because sometimes this may not seem like a loving behavior. Paul says love doesn't rejoice in wrong, takes no pleasure at wrongdoing. I don't know, sometimes we get the feel that love means that I just absolutely accept anything. Totally tolerate what everybody is doing and just overlook the wrongs and the evil that may be present in their life. Well, look, you can't read 1 Corinthians and come away with the idea that love is total tolerance. It's not. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 5, several chapters before Paul writes this great discussion on love, Paul comes down pretty forcefully on some problems that are happening in their church in Corinth. He's not celebrating the sin that happens there. He's not accepting it. He's not congratulating that man in 1 Corinthians 5 with that problem. Someone's mistake, failure, sin is never supposed to be a source of pleasure for a Christian. So do you sometimes find yourself celebrating when somebody really messes up? You find yourself sometimes, now you would never say it out loud, but maybe secretly, internally rejoicing when somebody else falls into hard times. You won't say, I told you so, but you'll think it because somebody has slipped into a mistake, a sin, a failure, or a fall. And you kind of like it that it happened to them and not you. Love does not take pleasure at wrongdoing. This is something that was present in the life of Jesus. And I was thinking about this, and whenever we think about the times in the life and the speeches of Jesus where he comes across with some force, sometimes those are things that people hold on to and they say, well, look, I don't think Jesus was very loving because, he flipped over the tables. Or he came down pretty hard in Matthew 23 on the Pharisees. But if you think about it, some of the things that Jesus did that are kind of marked as unloving are the most loving things that he could have done. He's got a group of folks who are supposed to be religious. And he says, you are mistreating the orphans and the widows. You're devouring their goods. You're devouring their houses. You're taking what they have and not helping them at all. And so Jesus comes out in Matthew 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. That's prophetic. He's kind of blasting them there. But he's doing it because they are mistreating everybody else. It would be unloving to the widows who've been mistreated for Jesus to not come down on their mistreaters. To the woman caught in the very act of adultery in John chapter 8, Jesus welcomes her, neither do I condemn you like nobody else does, but he also says, go and sin no more. Well, who's he to tell her how to live her life? Pretty unloving, unwelcoming behavior of Jesus, you may think. But if you think about someone like her and somebody like, it takes two, her partner, who knows how many lives have been wrecked by the kind of behavior that they are engaging in. And it would be really unloving for Jesus to come in and say nothing about that, or say, hey, it's okay what you're doing. It's not okay. Some things are not okay. And it's not loving. It's never loving to tolerate evil. It's pretty hateful because it allows the evil to spread. Love takes no pleasure at wrongdoing. That's true in the life of Jesus. It's true in our lives. And so, do you secretly enjoy when somebody falls into the trap? Instead, love joyfully celebrates truth. When you think about truth in the life of Jesus, truth was something he described as setting people free. We think of it as restrictive in our world sometimes. In our society, it's a restrictive thing. It tells me what I can and cannot do. Truth in the time of Jesus set you free to live the kind of life God created you to live. The truth would set you free from the restraints of the devil's lies and the enslavement to our flesh. And anytime somebody is removed from that, that's a reason to celebrate. Does it matter to you when people come clean about their faults? Does it matter to you? Do you celebrate when someone is baptized into Christ, when you see the shackles are removed and they are free to follow Jesus? Love never gets tired of supporting one another. Love never tires of supporting. Usually finds a way to help bear the burdens of other people. Doesn't look for anything in return. Are you someone who looks forward to that, or do you kind of hope that somebody else will bear that burden? Love never loses faith. It recognizes that people can change, and it remembers that people can change. Love never exhausts hope for good in the lives of other people. Finally, love never gives up. Love always holds out that someone can change, that things can get better, that people can come to Jesus or come back to Jesus. Love doesn't give up on people. That's 15 items. I don't know if you kept track. How'd you score? We don't need Ed Kiefer's invention to figure out if we're loving or not. What we need is Corinthians 13 to figure out, how's my life stack up against this test that Paul gives us? Do I wait patiently? Do I show kindness? Do I find myself burning with envy and bragging, inflating my own importance? Am I rude because I'm concerned only about myself and the interest of myself? Do I allow small things to grow into resentment? Do I keep score of how many things people have done to me? Do I take secret pleasure when people really fall? Do I celebrate truth? Do I support, keep faith, keep going, and never give up? What's your score when you try to measure love? I'd like for you to look at the first 3 verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Here's why it matters. Because Paul says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I've got prophetic powers, understand all mysteries and knowledge, and I have all faith to move mountains, but have not love, I'm nothing. If I give away all that I have and deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. You know what Paul said? He said, love matters. He said, no matter how you speak or what you say, no matter what you know or how smart you feel, no matter how much faith you think you've got, no matter how many sacrifices you've made in your life, Paul says, if I don't have love, it is worth nothing. And so, we're back to our original question. What is love? How do you measure love? I don't have a cupidoscope. I don't think that thing ever actually worked. I really don't need one. What I have is Jesus as an example for us, and Paul's list of 15 items to tell us exactly what love looks like. And all I need to do, look at my life and see how it lines up. The greatest picture of love you'll ever find is Jesus on the cross, selflessly emptying himself, giving himself for us. That's the clearest picture of God, of Jesus, of love that you'll ever find in the world. And it invites us to come and join and live that kind of loving life. And so one question I have for you is, have you started living that kind of life? A life of seeking God's will, of seeking the life of Jesus. A life of loving God and of loving your neighbor as yourself. It could start today. It could start today. You could decide today that you're going to live this kind of life. You could trust that this is the life that God wants you to live and that he gave Jesus so that you can live that kind of life. You can put your trust into action. You can be baptized today, your sins washed away, and you come up out of the waters freed from that, putting off the old, to begin living a new kind of life, like the one we've described here this morning. So maybe that's what you need, is to begin this journey. Or maybe you're a Christian. Maybe a Christian, and we've lost sight of what Jesus said in John chapter 13. They'll know you're a Christian. The world will know by the love you have for one another. If people are looking at your life, and if they had access to just, the words that you speak, nothing else about you, they don't know where you are on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. They know nothing else about you except how you treat people. They know nothing else about you except the words you use to talk to people. They know nothing else about you except how they see you respond to difficult situations at work or at school. What would they know about you? Would they think you're a Christian? Would your patience show them that, or your kindness? Would your envy and bragging and always inflated about yourself, would it show them that you're more concerned with yourself than anything else? When they hear how you talk about people that you disagree with, would they think that you take pleasure in their wrongdoing, or would they recognize by your words they know nothing else about you? They don't know where you are right now. Would they know that you joyfully celebrate the truth? When they look at how you deal with people around you, would they think that you seek out burdens to bear and that you always go and support people, and you bear all things and believe all things and hope all things and keep going? Or would they think that those things really don't matter to you a whole lot? Jesus said they'll know that we're Christians by the love that we have for one another. What would they know about you? Would they know you're a Christian? That's the question. And if you're not real sure about that, what do you think you'd need to change in your life so that they'll know you're Christians by the love you have for one another? If anything needs to change this morning, we invite you to do that while together we stand and while we sing this song to invite you.